All right, ready for another deep dive? This time, we're taking a look at complex adaptive systems.
CAS.
Yeah, CS for short.
Love it.
We're going to try to figure out how they work and why they're so important, especially when we're thinking about sustainability and, like the future of the planet.
Yeah, it's like, how do we make sure things keep going in a good way? And CAS might just hold some of those answers.
We've got some excerpts from Introduction to Earth's Complex Adaptive Systems to help guide our conversation.
Which sounds a little textbooky, I know.
It does.
But trust me, it's actually pretty interesting stuff.
Oh, yeah. Definitely more engaging than the title might suggest.
For sure.
It actually starts with something pretty simple.
Yeah.
Local market.
Yeah, where you go to get your groceries and stuff.
Exactly. And it uses the market to kind of illustrate how all these different parts, the buyers, the sellers, all the stuff being sold, and the money, how they all interact, under the set of rules.
It's like this constant dance between supply and demand, right?
Yeah, and all of that creates this system that's always changing, always adapting.
And that's what makes it a CAS. It's dynamic, it's unpredictable, but there are these patterns that emerge.
What I found really fascinating is how the source then connects that idea of a market, a social system, to our own bodies.
Oh, yeah. That's mind-blowing.
It is, right? Like all of a sudden you start thinking of your organs as these individual actors, all doing their own thing, but working together to, keep you alive.
It's like this intricate orchestra with every instrument playing its part to create this beautiful symphony, which is, you.
Exactly. And what makes FIAS so cool is that the behavior of the whole system, whether it's a market or your body, it comes from the interactions of all those individual parts.
Right. It's not just adding up the parts and getting the whole. It's like something new and more complex emerges from how those parts interact.
Emerges. Yeah, that's a good word for it. And then the source takes it even bigger, like way bigger.
Oh, yeah.
It argues that Earth itself is this giant, complex, adaptive system.
Whoa, that's thinking big picture.
Yeah, but it makes sense when you really start to think about it.
Like you've got the atmosphere, the oceans, the land, all the living things. They're all connected, all influencing each other.
It's all one giant interconnected web, right?
Totally. The source uses the example of a volcanic eruption.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
You know how it throws all this stuff into the air?
Ash, gases, all that.
Yeah, and that affects weather patterns, which then affects plant life, which then affects the oceans. Like it's this chain reaction that impacts the entire planet. It's amazing to think about how these seemingly isolated events can have consequences that ripple out across the whole system.
So if something changes in one part of the system,
it can totally cascade through the whole thing.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of feedback loops comes in, right?
Oh, yeah. Feedback loops are crucial for understanding how CAS work. It's like this cycle. A change in one part triggers a response in another, which then feeds back into the original change, either making it bigger or smaller.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah. Exactly. And those feedback loops can either help stabilize the system,
Keep things in balance.
or they can lead to, really rapid transformation, sometimes even tipping points.
Okay, I'm starting to get how these pieces fit together.
Me too.
But how does all of this relate to, the big question of sustainability?
Well, think about it this way. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about maintaining the health and balance of these complex systems, right?
Right, whether it's a specific ecosystem or the whole planet.
And the key is understanding how those systems work, how different parts are interconnected, and how our actions can create those ripple effects, those feedback loops that can either help or harm the system.
So it's not just about focusing on one isolated problem.
Like just planting more trees to solve deforestation, for example.
Yeah, we have to understand the whole system, the complex interactions, the feedback loops.
Because if we don't,
we could end up creating more problems than we solve.
Exactly. And that's why grasping these CAS concepts is so essential for creating a truly sustainable future.
It's like a whole new way of thinking about the world and our place in it.
Absolutely.
And that's where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, we'll look at some specific examples of how this CAS framework can help us tackle some of the, pretty huge challenges facing our planet.
Challenges, yeah, that's one way to put it.
For sure. So we're back, diving deeper into complex adaptive systems and, the the fate of humanity.
No pressure or anything?
None at all. But last time, we sort of established that practically everything, from our bodies to like entire ecosystems, function as these complex adaptive systems.
And we left off with this question, like, okay, how can understanding CAS actually help us solve these huge challenges we're facing, like climate change, social inequality, the whole shebang?
Right, because it's one thing to grasp the theory, but how do we translate that into actually making a difference?
Exactly.
Well, I think a good starting point is recognizing that our traditional way of solving problems, that linear approach, it often falls short when we're dealing with CS.
Can you give an example of what you mean by a linear approach?
Sure, think about traffic jams. A lot of times we try to fix them by just widening roads, right? Add more lanes, more space for cars.
Seems logical, right? More space, less traffic.
Yeah, in theory, but in a CAS, like a city's transportation network, that might just end up shifting the congestion somewhere else, or even encouraging more people to drive, which, defeats the purpose.
So instead of solving the problem, we just move it around or make it worse.
Pretty much. A more CS-informed approach would look at the system as a whole, the traffic patterns, why people are driving, what alternatives are available, and then, try to address those underlying factors.
So we might invest in public transit or make it easier for people to bike or walk to work.
Exactly. Or implement policies that encourage carpooling or flexible work hours to reduce rush hour traffic. It's about finding those leverage points within the system.
Leverage points, those are those places where a small change can have a big impact, right?
Exactly. And this reminds me of something from that Introduction to Earth's Complex Adaptive Systems text. It talked about how CAS are characterized by emergence.
Emergence, that's where the behavior of the system is greater than just the sum of its parts, right?
Yes. Think about a flock of birds flying in those intricate formations.
Oh, yeah, or an ant colony building these massive, complex structures.
Right. No single bird or ant is in charge, but somehow this complex behavior emerges from their interactions.
It's like, whoa, how does that even happen?
It's amazing, right? And the key takeaway for us is that we need to understand these emergent properties if we want to effectively influence the system.
So we need to work with the complexity, not against it.
Exactly. Trying to oversimplify or control a CAS is, usually a recipe for disaster.
It's about finding those points where we can nudge the system in a more, beneficial direction.
It's like understanding the complex dance and finding the right steps to influence the rhythm.
I like that. It's a good analogy. But we can't just focus on the technical aspects, right?
Yeah.
We also need to consider the ethical dimensions.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that Fabric of Ethics source we mentioned earlier, they argue that ethics are absolutely crucial for addressing these global challenges.
But how does that connect to CAS thinking specifically?
Well, because CAS are so interconnected, right, our actions can have these ripple effects, these unintended consequences that reach far beyond our immediate sphere.
So we need to think about the ethical implications of those ripple effects.
Exactly. A purely technical solution to climate change might focus solely on reducing emissions through things like, renewable energy.
Which is important.
Of course.
Yeah.
But it doesn't address the underlying social and economic systems that are driving the problem in the first place.
Right. So we might end up creating new inequalities or even unintended environmental consequences.
Exactly. Switching to electric cars is great, but if the electricity is still generated from fossil fuels, have we really solved the problem?
We might even be creating new ones.
Exactly. A CAS-informed, ethically grounded approach would look at the bigger picture, ask those tougher questions.
Like, how can we create a more equitable and sustainable economic system? How can we shift consumption patterns and ensure the transition benefits everyone, not just, a select few?
Exactly. It's about understanding that there's no single solution, no magic bullet. It's about recognizing the complexity and making ethical choices at every level.
And that's where individual action becomes so important. We can't just wait for governments or corporations to solve these problems.
We have to start thinking and acting as part of these complex systems ourselves, recognizing that we're all interconnected.
That's like empowering in a way, right? Knowing that our choices, even the small ones, can ripple out and have an impact.
You think about it like a tipping point, right?
Mm-hmm.
One person biking to work might not seem like much.
But if enough people do it,
it can trigger a shift in transportation patterns, infrastructure, even social norms. It's about understanding CAS and realizing we can actively shape the future we want.
Okay, I'm feeling a little more optimistic now. But are there any, potential downsides or dangers to this approach?
That's a great question. Because it's not all sunshine and roses, right? There are definitely some pitfalls to watch out for with CAS thinking.
Like what? Give me the worst case scenario.
Well, I think one danger is oversimplification. CAS are intricate, and it's tempting to reduce that complexity to something more manageable, something we can easily grasp.
But that could lead to inaccurate predictions or solutions that don't actually address the root cause, right? Like assuming that simply banning plastic straws will solve the ocean plastic crisis.
Exactly. We need to respect the complexity of these systems while still trying to understand them.
So walk that tightrope between simplification and recognizing the inherent messiness of it all.
Right. And another issue is that we can sometimes lose sight of the individuals within the system when we're focusing on the whole.
Right. Like we don't want to treat people as just data points or cogs in a machine, right?
Exactly. Ethical considerations always have to be at the forefront. Remember, CAS are made up of people with unique needs and experiences.
So avoid those like dystopian sci-fi scenarios where individuals are sacrificed for the quote-unquote greater good.
Precisely. And then there's the issue of unintended consequences. Because CAS are so interconnected, it's really hard to predict how intervening in one part will affect other parts.
So we need to be cautious but not paralyzed by that uncertainty.
Right. And this brings up another crucial point. CAS thinking is not a one-and-done solution.
It's an ongoing process.
Exactly. It's about constant experimentation, observation, adaptation.
So we need to be bold in addressing urgent issues like climate change.
Absolutely.
But also be prepared to learn, adapt, maybe even change course along the way.
That's the key. Finding that balance between urgency and understanding, action and reflection.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is, but I think the potential rewards are enormous. Now, one comment that often comes up is, how do we actually get people to embrace this CAS thinking? Because let's face it, it can seem pretty abstract.
Yeah, it's not exactly dinner table conversation.
Right, but I think we can start with relatable examples like those traffic jams or even our own bodies as CAS. Starting with those familiar experiences can help make the concept less intimidating, more accessible.
And then gradually build up to understanding more complex systems.
Exactly. And I think storytelling is crucial, too. People connect with narratives, with examples they can relate to.
Give me a story, hook me.
And CAS are full of amazing stories, from the intricate relationships within ecosystems to the emergence of social movements. There are so many examples of how these complex systems work and how we can influence them.
Okay, I'm getting inspired here. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the key message? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I'd say cultivate a CAS mindset. Start seeing the world through the lens of interconnectedness. Question those simple solutions, embrace the complexity, and recognize that even small, individual actions can make a difference.
I love that. It's about shifting our perspective, seeing ourselves as part of this incredible, complex, ever-evolving dance.
And by understanding the steps, we can become more skillful dancers, shaping the future of the system we're all a part of.
All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into complex adaptive systems and sustainability.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring all these intricate systems.
Yeah, for sure. Lots to think about.
Definitely.
As we've been talking about all this, there's one thought that keeps coming back to me.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we've been focusing on how understanding CAS can help us solve problems and create a better future.
Right, empowering ourselves with knowledge.
Exactly. But it also kind of reveals just how complex the world really is. It's like all these interconnected parts, feedback loops, unintended consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can definitely feel overwhelming.
It does. How do we even begin to grasp all of that? How do we avoid getting paralyzed by the sheer complexity of it all?
That's a great question, and it's something I've struggled with too. But I think the key is to shift our focus from feeling overwhelmed to feeling empowered.
Okay, but how do we actually do that? How do we move from everything is so complex to, okay, what can I do?
I think it starts with recognizing that complexity doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can actually be a source of hope.
Hope? Really?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it.
Think about it this way. In a simple linear system, change usually happens pretty slowly and predictably, right? You push a button and you get a specific result.
Cause and effect, yeah.
Exactly. But in a CAS, small changes can sometimes trigger massive, unexpected shifts. The system is more dynamic, more responsive.
Like those tipping point examples we were talking about before.
Yeah.
Where one person making a change can inspire others, and then boom, the whole system shifts.
Precisely. So while our actions might have unintended consequences, which can be a little scary.
Definitely.
They also have the potential to create positive change on a scale that we might not even imagine.
So it's like we have to accept the uncertainty,
Embrace it.
but also recognize that we have more agency than we think.
Exactly. We're not just passive bystanders, we're active participants in shaping these systems. And that's where understanding CAS becomes so crucial.
Because it helps us see the system more clearly.
Identify those leverage points.
And then act in ways that are more likely to nudge things in the direction we want them to go.
Exactly. It's like having a map of the system, but it's a map that's constantly changing, evolving.
Which makes it all the more important to keep learning, keep adapting.
And that reminds me of something from Introduction to Earth's Complex Adaptive Systems. It talked about how CAS are constantly adapting and evolving themselves, right?
Dynamic, always changing.
Exactly. So even if we make mistakes, the system has a certain resilience built in. It can often course correct over time.
So we don't have to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to be willing to try, to learn, to adapt.
That's the beauty of it. Embrace experimentation, be willing to fail, learn from those mistakes. It's all part of the process.
This conversation has really shifted my perspective. I'm feeling, less overwhelmed and actually more curious and hopeful.
That's wonderful to hear, because that's the shift we need to see happening on a larger scale.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into complex adaptive systems, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can they do with all this information?
Cultivate a CS mindset. Start seeing the world through that lens of interconnectedness. Recognize that you're part of a complex system, and your actions, however small, have ripple effects. So choose wisely.
And don't be afraid to experiment, to get involved, to support initiatives that are working towards a more sustainable future, a more ethical future. Even those small steps can contribute to something much larger.
And above all, don't lose hope. The world is complex, yes, but it's also full of possibilities. By understanding how these systems work, we can empower ourselves to make a real difference.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the world is a complex adaptive system, but so are you. And that means you have the power to learn, to adapt, and to shape the future.